Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to this webinar, which is part of York Minster's marking of this season of Creationtide. Every year, the Church marks the season of Creationtide running through September and concluding on the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi. This year, we also anticipate the World COP26 UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, which fast approaches. So here at York Minster, in a series of webinars and special services and events, we reflect on the climate challenges that we face together, and we explore how we can all faithfully respond through prayer and through action. We're going to hear voices from across the globe who help us consider our place in creation, and we explore theologies of creation and climate and consider the climate emergency as the primary justice issue of our age. This evening, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Andy Atkins, CEO of Rocha UK, a Christian organisation engaging communities in nature conservation. He has been described as one of the leading environmentalists. He most recently led Friends of the Earth, and he previously worked with Catholic International Development Charities CAFOD and Progressio, and then set up Tearfund's policy and campaigns work. He was a founder of the 2005 Make Poverty History campaign. We're really delighted to welcome Andy to speak to us this evening, and the title to which he speaks is Any Earthly Use? Can the Church make an effective response to climate change? Before we begin, I'm going to say a prayer to prepare our hearts and minds to hear Andy's words for us. Glorious God, the whole creation proclaims your marvelous work. Increase in us a capacity to wonder and delight in it, that heaven's praise may echo in our hearts and our lives be spent as good stewards of the earth, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be with you tonight. And I very much look forward to discussion at the end of what I've got to say. I feel that we are in such extraordinary times that any individual or any organisation that thinks it has the whole answer is deluding itself, certainly, and certainly kidding other people. It is absolutely essential that we share ideas, share what works, share what doesn't work. So I come tonight in that spirit, and thank you very much for York Minster for having me. I wish I could be there. I love York. I've been many times, but at the moment we are blessed by the possibilities of Zoom. So it's good to be with you in that form. The world's waking up, isn't it? Albeit belatedly, to the fact that there is a climate crisis. I think the last few weeks have been a big demonstration of that. Fires, floods, awful scenes from around the world and from quite close to home, places where many Britons go on holiday. And then, of course, we've had the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that has underlined in unusually blunt terms for scientists how close to the cliff edge we are. A takeaway would be that we have already left it much too late to avoid considerable damage, and that we have less than 10 years probably to cut greenhouse gas emissions globally by 40%, to have an earthly chance of keeping temperature beneath 1.5 degrees above the historical average. And that is what the number that scientists are saying. Beyond that, anything could happen, and probably will. It's incredibly serious. If we break through that barrier, it's going to be serious enough keeping this side of that barrier, but we really don't want to go there, is what they're saying. So this is an emergency, and we cannot avoid further damage, which basically means the two questions now, I think, facing organizations, citizens, leaders, everybody really, if we'll face up to it, is what must we do to limit climate change to the smallest amount possible, the smallest amount we can possibly limit it to. And secondly, how can we endure the damage that is already happening and will get worse, even if we in the end succeed in avoiding runaway climate change, because it is going to get worse. And how can we, in this audience, as churches, as pastors, as Christians who care for others, reduce that damage and manage that damage, and create resilience to limit that damage that climate change will now inevitably do. These are tough questions, but we have to face them as societies and as sectors of societies like the church is. Nevertheless, I am encouraged, although these are big and somewhat dire questions, I am very encouraged as to what I think the churches could contribute to this debate and to action, more than debate, action. And I'll talk about that. I want to say just a little bit about Rocha UK. That's my day job, as well as chairing the Climate Sunday Coalition, because Rocha UK does exist to mobilize Christians and churches to care for the environment. So I'm coming here partly because we long to see Christians caring for all of creation, people and nature. But to me, it's also personal. I'm not a clergyman. I'm one of the few people around this screen that I can see that doesn't have a dog collar on, and that's not accidental. I should not be wearing one. I'm not a clergyman, but I come from a long line of them. My grandfather, my father, his two brothers, eventually my mother, were all ordained. And just when I thought the genes had run out with me, my son got ordained, and now my wife is ordained too. So I am totally surrounded. I have huge sympathy with church leaders because I've lived among them, and I hope I have some understanding of the realities of the church and the pressures on the church as well, from family life, frankly, over several generations now. So if I speak apparently critically of the church at times, please understand I love the church. I want it to thrive. I'm not here to knock the church. I want the church to be what it should be, as the carrier of God's love to the world. And I approach climate change in the church in that light. So tonight I'll look at why should the church, act on climate change. That'll be pretty brief because I hope that's fairly obvious. Then I'll look in more depth at what's the potential for churches to make a difference. That's the guts of the talk, if you like. And then I'll look at what we can actually do now, how we should actually act now in this incredibly important year when in Britain we have this unique opportunity as well as responsibility of hosting the next International Climate Summit. Okay, so why should churches act on climate change? I would say there's some fairly obvious reasons. I suspect that the biblical basis for this will be unpacked in future seminars, but let me just summarize it because I think it's worthwhile that we carry that around in our hearts and minds to convince ourselves if we sometimes need convincing, but also to have to explain to others who may ask that question. That's understandable. Many people have a view of the church that would lead them to think it's quite strange that the church is acting on this. I don't think that. So the biblical basis is, I think, a double mandate. First of all, from the start of the Bible to the end, there is the evidence and the constant repetition that God created all the earth and everything in it. He loves it and cares for it. And more than that, you go to Genesis chapter 2, right near the start. We are put in the garden to care for it. We can have lots of debates about other words that are there, but it's very obvious from the study of the scriptures, God created it, loves it, and wants us to do the same. Why then is it okay to trash it? The church should be in the lead in caring for God's creation. The second reason, I would say, is that, again, the golden rule that exists in many faiths, but which Jesus so eloquently re-emphasized in the parable of the Good Samaritan, love thy neighbor. We now know, of course, that climate change is having a massive impact on the poor and the vulnerable in the world, and will get much, much worse. So it's very difficult to claim that we are loving our nature if we are knowingly taking part in activities that actually undermine the livelihoods and the lives of our neighbors. None of us would think that's right. Sometimes we may wonder what choices we have, and I'll come to that. It's sometimes hard to do the right things because we don't have the money, or society is not set up to make it easy for us, for example, to cycle instead of taking our car. and so on. But actually, in principle, if we are to love our neighbour, we now need to recognise that climate change is massively undermining the livelihoods and lives of our neighbours now and future generations. So it becomes a justice issue via that, I believe. Biblical double mandate to care for God's creation and to protect our neighbour, both of which involve us tackling climate change. So that's the double mandate from the Bible. I would say there's also an obvious civic responsibility. Any person or any sector of society that says they take no responsibility for society around them is rightly, I think, considered not just strange, but actually not very helpful, not conducive to good society. So I think the church and Christians rightly perceive themselves as members of civil society. And if we are going to be responsible members of civil society, actually we have a civic duty to act on any threat to the whole of society. Of course, that's quite linked, I think, in the development of Western thought, actually to those biblical principles of love thy neighbour, which underpin actually much of what we have come to see as liberal democratic values: civil society, civic action, civil engagement, the right to vote, all of those things. So it's right as members of society that we act on this too. So what's the potential? Let me turn now to the guts of this. What's the potential for churches to make a difference? When I was first appointed to my role at Rocha, I met an old colleague of mine. I worked very closely with him when I was at Friends of the Earth, and he was head of Greenpeace. He said, "So what are you going to do now?" And I said, "I'm going to Rocha." He said, "What's that? Never heard of it. What do they do?" And I said, "Well," I explained what it is: a Christian environmental conservation charity. But I said, "Well, what we're really setting out to do is mobilize Christians and churches to care for the environment." He looked at me and said, "Well, good luck with that." Which implied not only that it might be a hard task, but actually, why would you want to do that? What difference could the church make? I would like to think, and I do say this to John when I see him, look what's happened. Not just because of me, I don't mean that at all, but I think we are seeing a massive growth in Christian and church engagement on the environment. That's itself very, very good news. And I'll come back to that and ask, where could that take us? But let me just delve into what I think are the assets of the church. What can it bring to the table on this issue? Because I think they're a unique set of assets. First of all, the numbers and geographical spread. And here I'm just talking about the UK. To contain this discussion, let me limit it largely to the UK, but of course, it's writ large world over. We have, according to the statistics I've got, about 50,000 place-based worshiping communities, what you and I might call church. Some don't have a building. Some now have lots of people coming in by Zoom from all over the world, but there are about 50,000 self-defined churches, Christian churches in this country. That is a huge number. And they are in every village, every town, every neighborhood of every city, with a few exceptions. Yes, there might be benefices where one poor vicar has to administer 12 churches, each with only 3 people in. I know that. But we are institutionally present as a church in about 50,000 places. That's incredible. It's probably more than the post office now. I don't know. I'll need to do my sums on that. Don't quote me. But it's a huge spread. Imagine if just a quarter of that number of churches started to really demonstrate what it looks like to care for God's creation in that place, tackling climate change, tackling biodiversity loss, and so on. What a practical difference it would make, but what an influence it would have across the country. Then, of course, those communities, most of them have buildings. Yes, they are old and leaky, but that's the point. They're dripping, they're leaking carbon emissions, they're leaking heat. So we have huge scope for cutting our carbon emissions if we have the courage and the persistence to deal with that problem. Yes, I know it's expensive. Yes, I know there are all sorts of historical societies that don't want you to do this or that with a building. We have to ask, what's the priority here? Humanity's survival or that the building looks just the same way it was 200 years ago? We have to ask that. We have to ask that and persist in getting the right answer as soon as we can, because we have a huge contribution to make cutting our carbon emissions in buildings. But these buildings aren't just leaking heat. They are also gathering places potentially. They are and could be a service to the wider community, where we ask anybody who's interested in tackling this issue to convene there, to thrash out what we can do together as a community, to use the space to build the capacity of the community to deal with not just cutting carbon emissions, but that issue of resilience. How do we cope with the damage that is coming? So churches are spaces for convening as well as buildings to cut carbon. And then there's land. There's more and more work coming out now showing how important land is to helping us deal with the climate crisis. Now, let me be clear at this point. We are being clear as a Rocha every time we get asked this. There is no substitute for cutting fossil fuel use. First, second, and third, we need to cut fossil fuel use very, very quickly. But when we have done that, using land to absorb carbon emissions, managing our land better for nature and for climate, which can go together, is going to be essential for restoring our carbon sinks, our forests, re-wetting wetlands, re-flourishing our grasslands, managing our farms and our farming techniques in a way that absorbs more carbon, is going to be an essential part of the mix in keeping climate change under control in the midterm. There's not a short-term fix. The short-term fix, if there is one, is get off fossil fuel as quickly as you can. But we need to get started now on so-called nature-based solutions to climate change, because they are not quick, because we will need them in the midterm, which means we have to start now. Therefore, land, and the land that the churches have, becomes incredibly important. Now, many, many churches around the country have churchyards. It's in small parcels. But even if churches just left half of their churchyard unmown for nature and planted a couple more trees, many have many trees already, that begins to make a difference. But by the time you add in the land owned by the church commissioners and other denominations, and the land owned by a large number of Christian organizations and charities and conference centers and retreat centers and Christian-owned aristocratic estates, believe it or not, there are so many forms of Christian managed land. Our approximate calculations as Rocha is there's 500,000 acres out there, which you could say is owned or managed by the church or Christians in the UK. That could make a phenomenal difference if it was used consciously to help cut carbon. And on that note, we as a Rocha are deliberately convening Christian land managers to look at how to do that, getting started on that, because we believe there is so much scope for making a contribution to this societal challenge using Christian managed land. But to avoid catastrophic climate change, as I've said, we've got to get our fossil fuel very, very fast. And that's where a fourth asset of the church comes in very, very powerfully, and that's the people numbers. We reckon, depending on whose latest statistics you want to look at, and obviously that's going to now change with COVID, although predictions on which way are again diverse, but there could be 2 to 3 million regular churchgoers in this country. That's a lot of people. Now, what would happen if even a quarter of those people decided to go for it in getting off fossil fuel in their own life, but also asking government to do what it can to get the country off fossil fuels? So that the people numbers are incredibly significant, because addressing climate change is not just a technical issue. It's a societal issue, a cultural issue, because we are going to have to make rapid change and sustain it. Many of those changes could be incredibly good for us, incredibly beneficial, not just in staving off catastrophic climate change, but actually in reintroducing the public to actually much better ways of life, more community, a slower pace, healthier food, and more contact with nature. All of those things are good things. but there will have to be big and fast changes. That's a social issue, not just a technological one. So we need people who will live it and who will promote it and who will enjoy it and help other people to enjoy that change. Could Christians be that group of people to lead the way? There's enough of us. We've got a biblical mandate. We, in theory, have the ethical values to encourage us to do so. I think we should, and we could. Then, of course, fifth thing, the financial clout of the church. Now, I know that within the Church of England, what it does with its money, whether it divests from fossil fuels and so on, is a very big issue. But the fact that it's a very big issue is because there's a lot of money. Nobody would be worried if, or arguing about it so much, if the significance of the money was not so significant. But actually, whether the Church of England gets its money out of fossil fuel, whether local churches that have a lot of money, and some do have investments, keep it in fossil fuel or get it out, could make a very big difference. And therefore we have influence. And then there's the sixth thing, our influence on the public debate and political debate. Now that could happen through all of those things I've already mentioned. Locally, churches doing the right thing and just talking about it in the local press. In my local church, we've had a very interesting experience recently of doing a nature count on the land outside the church. It's a scrappy piece of land, in a 60s housing estate. And the number of questions we had from people when we were out there doing it was just extraordinary. Just doing stuff visibly makes people ask what's going on. Actually, it's a great missional opportunity if you're looking for one, but we didn't do it for that reason. It just encourages conversations. But in addition to the local impact of action, think about the fact that there are so many Christian leaders in business, so many Christians in politics. The Church of England even has, 26 bishops, the Lord Spiritual, in our upper house. And many of them have indeed been speaking out on environment for many, many years. But we have huge possibilities to have influence because of that. And then last of all, I would say there is our international networks, and the fact that we are a global church. The churches are global. We're in every country. We can bring to the table the evidence of the impacts of climate change on the ground, the stories of people, to help build public understanding here and also put pressure on the politicians. My very first trip for Tearfund when I worked there, a year after I started, was to Central America. And some of you may remember Hurricane Mitch. At the time, it was the biggest hurricane that had ever been known. And it caused disastrous flooding in Central America. It destroyed many, many communities. I think about 10,000 lives were lost. It washed away, literally, projects that Tearfund and public money from British supporters had been supporting for many years. Scientists said at the time, if climate change develops the way we think it will, then this will become the norm. I can tell you now, it's become the norm. Almost every year now, the Philippines and places like that are hit by hurricanes of a similar size. But it was that, in fact, that led me to set up with my team at the time, the climate change program at Tearfund, now 20 or so years old and still very much going. And it was bringing the stories of what I was seeing on the ground that helped persuade not just Tearfund supporters, but actually quite skeptical colleagues I had at the time, that climate change was going to be a really big development problem. Taken out of its environmental box, it was going to kill people. It is killing people. And it was the stories from the ground that helped convince people. The church has huge scope to do that. So I could go on. You get the picture. There's much that we can bring to the table on this. And I think it's urgent, absolutely urgent, that we do. So I'm going to draw this section to a close. But just before I jump to what can we do then in this year of COP, I just want to talk about, so where is the church at on this? I have a hope that the church can do so much more, but it's not as if we're not doing anything. There are many, many people within the churches that have been beavering away on these issues for decades. In that sense, I'm a latecomer. We have to acknowledge there have been people bravely persisting with this, and it's been a very, very lonely task for many, many decades. The good news is, I think many more Christians and churches and church leaders are now coming on board. And we see the evidence of that in my day job in Rocha, UK. To give a couple of examples, and many of you will know, there was a scheme called Eco Congregation. It had brought a couple of hundred churches into action on environment generally over some years. In 2016, Rocha was asked to take it over. We relaunched it effectively as Eco Church. In that time, in the last 5 years, we have now seen almost 4,000 churches register with Eco Church. I don't just think that's because the brilliance of Eco Church or a Rocha. It's because there is a massive wave of change shaping the churches. So much more awareness, and that's probably as much to do with David Attenborough's films and heat waves as it is to anything a Rocha has done. We've got to be humble about this, but we see the evidence of that interest from the churches in getting on for 4,000 churches now registered for Eco Church. Of those, more than 1,000 have got awards, including quite recently Salisbury Cathedral getting a gold award. So if a 1,000-year-old building can get to gold, actually, who can't if they've got the persistence and the courage to do it? It's a big challenge. I'm not denying that. But actually, if Salisbury can get gold, what are the limits to what churches can do on this? And then we see it also in other schemes. I mean, Eco Church is not the only one. We have sister schemes. Eco Congregation in Scotland, Eco Congregation in Ireland, Live Simply, which is run by CAFOD, the Catholic Development Agency for the Catholic Church. Between us, we are now approaching 5,000 registered churches, which is getting on for 10% of the number of churches in Britain. So that's quite significant change in the last few years. So if I sound down about what the church needs to do, please let me clarify. The church has come a very long way in the last few years, and we can really build on that. Then let me talk about the land managers. I talked a lot about land. We run, as I said, as a Rocha, a scheme. We call it Partners in Action, and it brings together Christian land managers. To give you some examples of members, Scargill in Yorkshire is it Yorkshire or Derbyshire? I'm pretty certain it's Yorkshire. Please say yes. Is a member. So is Lee Abbey in Devon. Many of you will know. But we started off only a couple of years ago. There were about 10 or so. We've already got into the low 20s, but we've got a queue of Christian land managers, Christian estates, conference centers, even cathedrals now wanting to join faster than we can assess them. And the deal is that what we are doing is learning together how to manage land for cutting carbon, how to manage land for nature, and how to manage land so that the public can get the benefits of God's creation as well. There's kind of mandate we all sign up to, a charter rather we all signed up to, and we are strongly predicting that we will probably have a membership of about 40 to 50 within the next couple of years, which is leading us to say, why don't we try to bring 25,000 acres of Christian managed land into play for cutting carbon within 5 years? We think that's probably going to be possible. And not, again, because of a Rocha's brilliance, but because of the wave of interest now and understanding emerging that this is necessary and that we can do something like this if we put our minds to it. So there's just a couple of examples. Of course, as you will know, at the higher denominational level, churches have not been inactive as well. Many denominations have now set net zero targets. The Anglican Church or Church of England for 2030, Church in Wales has a 2030 target. Church in Scotland has a 2030 target. Church of Scotland is, of course, Presbyterian, not Anglican. So we've got churches making these bold statements about where they want to go. Progress on divestment has been somewhat slower, but Church of Scotland has announced in May of this year that it will be divesting. As you will be very aware, it's a very hot debate within the Church of England about divestment or continued engagement. We can no doubt talk about that, but I think it's almost inevitable, it is essential, I would say, that anybody with money in fossil fuels gets it out of fossil fuels as soon as they can. I realize there are all sorts of complications about that, but we just cannot, the world cannot afford for us to continue to drive a fossil fuel economy. We need to put the brake on it as fast as we can. But churches are starting to do so. So let me close now by looking at what do churches do now in the run-up to COP in this country. If you've been reading the papers, watching the news, you won't need me to tell you how essential this climate summit is. It is an extraordinarily important chance to ratchet up the ambition of countries, and particularly to agree long promised but never delivered finance to developing countries. 100 billion a year was the number agreed in Paris in 2015. That was due to be delivered and kept up every year from 2020. Now going on for 2 years ago, it's never happened. So it's absolutely essential to build trust as well as to help developing countries switch to a green economy, that we deliver on that aid as well as on higher ambition for faster cuts to reach that 40% cut in greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years. However, we're not in a good place. We can talk about the should it be postponed or not in a minute. Some might want to talk about that, but even leaving that aside, the main issue is that the rich countries, and particularly Britain, I'm afraid, hosting this conference, is still taking decisions domestically that undermine its credibility to lead the world. So there is an urgent need for us in Britain to get our government to do what it should at home before it even leads COP. So that is why many of us got together and organized the Climate Sunday initiative. And I think we can put the link in the chat in a minute. The Climate Sunday initiative brings together more than 30 denominations and charities, all the ones you've heard of and some you haven't, to try to do something together in this unique year. And what it is asking churches to do, and I'm delighted that York Minster is doing exactly this in a couple of weeks' time, is to, first of all, hold a service where you look at the theology and the science of climate change, educate ourselves on this issue and pray about it, of course. Secondly, then at that service or soon after, make a commitment as a church to ongoing action yourself, because whatever the result of COP, even if it's absolutely brilliant in policy terms, at that point, it's still only words. The governments will have to be kept to their promises. And even if we keep them to their promises, they will need public support to carry them out. We will still need to change. So there's an urgent need for churches to decide for themselves what action they're going to take and sustain it. We're suggesting you use Climate Sunday to make that kind of commitment. It could be, if you're in Scotland, joining Eco Congregation Scotland. It could be, if you're in York, in your local church. If you're already bronze in Eco Church, let's say, committing to get to silver in the next year, go forward, set a timetable, make the effort, but use COP as the impetus to do that. And the third thing Climate Sunday is asking churches to do is to sign the Time Is Now declaration. It's a wider civil society declaration. It's already got more than 150,000 signatures that you can sign it as a church as well as an individual. And that is calling upon the government to get Britain back on track in its greenhouse gas targets, cuts targets, and also to invest the vast sums of COVID recovery money that are being invested in a green economy, not in continuing to drive a fossil fuel economy, which sadly at the moment is what is happening. Only a very small percentage of those COVID recovery funds are actually being spent on green stuff. We've got a £27 billion road building program that was announced a few months ago, going in exactly the wrong direction from where we need to go. So there is an urgent need for churches to speak out now. Now, the good news, that Climate Sunday initiative is a really brilliant example, I think, of collaboration. We need churches to collaborate together. We need, frankly, the charities to collaborate together and put aside their own institutional imperative, obviously, to raise funds for their work. That is necessary. But this is a year when we need to see everybody working together to deliver a common goal. Last weekend, I was in Glasgow. We presented the initial participation in this campaign. We had to change our original presentation from one day to the next because in the last 48 hours before the service in Glasgow Cathedral, the nation's Climate Sunday service, another 150 churches registered that they would be doing a service. There's now more than 2,000 services have been registered, and there is 7 weeks left. So we would strongly encourage anybody listening to this and who is in a church who hasn't yet done it to try to arrange for there to be a Climate Sunday service, one of those Sundays in your church. There's plenty of resources available on the website to help you with that. But then make that commitment to what you're going to do next. And we know that hundreds of churches have committed to further action of one sort or another. We also know that hundreds have also signed the Time Is Now declaration. I'm hoping that within about a week's time, I will be with other representatives of that initiative, taking the results of that actually to Downing Street, but we will also announce the final numbers at COP itself. And we would very much like to see and believe it's possible that by then we could have several hundred, if not thousands more participants. And that way we can have a strong voice. We can say to the government and to the public, churches care about this. But that will also carry so much more influence, of course, if it's backed by our own commitments. And that in the end, I think, is going to be the thing that makes the practical difference on the ground, as well as helping give this government or future governments political space to take the bold actions they need to take. So can the church make an earthly difference? I think it can. I think we are doing quite a bit already, perhaps in contrast to 10 years ago. But I think we have still got a very, very long way to go to make maximum use of the incredible assets that we have. We also serve a loving God. We believe in prayer. I do believe God can do miracles. And I think that if the church organizes itself and church heirs collaborate with each other, including Christian charities, I think we could see the most incredible things that it's hard to even imagine at the moment. And how good that would be for the church itself, not just for heading off catastrophic climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy, for an incredibly passionate and positive presentation, but not without its major challenge, I think, to each of us in our own context. We're going to finish with a prayer. Before I do that, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us who are watching live now, and those who may be watching this in the future. Thank you so much, Andy, and we pray God's blessing on all of your work. And the way that you inspire others to make change in their own lives and in the lives of their communities. And I'm just going to close us with a prayer. Tend the earth, care for God's good creation, and bring forth the fruits of righteousness. Go in the peace of Christ. Thanks be to God.